our special coverage on Israel's continued targeting and killing of journalists in Gaza, and just the general war on the media landscape. There's over 200 journalists that have been murdered since last year, and this is accounting for more than 70% of journalists killed worldwide in the same period. This is not just a war on Palestine, it's a war on the truth itself at this point. And joining us now is Dr. Myriam François. She's a presenter at The T. This is a YouTube channel. I think it's really, really cool. You guys should check it out. She's also a British journalist, filmmaker, and writer for a lot of publications, including the BBC, Channel 4, and also Al Jazeera. Dr. Myriam François, thank you so much for joining us. Really, really, looking forward to this eye-opening conversation. And
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, we've been discussing, the systematic nature of some of these killings, and how Israel has literally turned Gaza into the deadliest place on earth for journalists to be and to exist and to work. When the press is completely wiped out, who is left to bear witness? And are we at the risk at some point to being completely blind to the lived horrific realities in Gaza and the rest of Palestine?
Wow. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the show and for discussing this vitally important topic. As you said, Gaza is currently the most dangerous place in the world to be a journalist, but also to be a child, to be a health worker. It is somewhere where all of the red lines that were created as part of the kind of Second World War infrastructure of the sort of never again after the Holocaust, right? We're going to establish certain rules that mean that, whatever conflict there is in the world, there are certain groups that will always be protected, whether it's journalists, health workers, children, civilians. And unfortunately, all of those red lines are systematically infringed in the context of Israel's onslaught on Gaza. And as you point out, the real question for those of us who are outside of Gaza is, on one hand is I think we are observing a systematic annihilation of truth tellers from inside Gaza, meaning we can observe what appears to be the targeting of people who have a particular platform and a particular ability to communicate. So that whether that's people like the poet Rifat Al-Harir, who was himself targeted in a very targeted bombing on his apartment building. The rest of the building was actually left standing, and his floor was the one specifically targeted, all through to the most recent horrific images we've seen of the journalism tent outside a hospital that was targeted in a missile strike, and we saw a journalist burnt alive in that. So we're seeing sort of horrors upon horrors, but they're not sort of random horrors. They seem to be very much indicating to us that not only does Israel want to ensure that the rest of the world's eyes can't be on this by allowing anyone in, because as you and I both know, international journalists have been systematically denied entry into Gaza, but also ensuring that being a journalist, being part of the group within Gazan society, Palestinian society in Gaza, who are committed to reporting it, becomes an extremely dangerous job. I have friends in Gaza who are journalists who say to me, my family don't want me to sleep at home. My friends ask me not to come and visit because we believe we have a target on our back. And so I guess, the long-winded answer is to say the big question for the rest of us outside is how do we ensure that the attempts to silence the voice of those inside is not successful? That's our job as journalists on the outside, right? If you're trying to silence them, then our job is to ensure you will not succeed in silencing them, whatever you do.
And I think you're encroaching on my next point. I wanted to touch on international complicity.
Yes.
So often I think we are now seeing it more than ever before is Western governments and just media outlets that often parrot Israel's claim that these killings are accidental. Yet there's a continued supplying of weapons and platforms like the BBC routinely downplaying this mass slaughter that we're seeing. Is this not a case of institutional collaboration when it comes to silencing Palestinian narratives to the rest of the world?
So I think there are two things that are, the situation in Gaza has itself become sort of a litmus test for so many things in our society. But one of them has been the quality of our media landscape has been revealed to be deeply co-opted. And I think it's been co-opted in
Mm,
two main ways. I think we always have known that public broadcasters have a tendency to align with the foreign policy position of the country that is funding them. Even in the case of the UK, where technically it's not government funding, it's actually the British public, right, who fund the BBC through taxpayers' contributions. We still see a sort of deference towards UK foreign policy positions as the sort of standard go-to line. And I think that the issue on Gaza is that that line is so clearly at odds with the values that Britain purports to uphold in other parts of the world, and is so deeply at odds with, any semblance of humanity, compassion, or international law, that it's led to a real crisis in trust in the traditional institutions of news gathering and news distribution. And then also, then obviously, on the other hand, we have private interest owned media companies, a growing number of those here in the UK and across the world, where private interest groups are using these platforms and the sort of veneer of respectability that they offer in order to try and garner support for their political/economic interests. So in both of those senses, I think we have a crisis before us. And I think in the case of the BBC, it's been a huge internal crisis. We've had journalists within, write hundreds writing letters complaining about the editorial line. Many have resigned. Many have had very tough internal tough internal conversations. So, clearly there is an issue whereby the industry itself is aware that there is a problem in how we report on
mm,
Palestine. The question we haven't resolved is whether those journalists who are true to the profession are kind of willing to go all the way to the top with the accountability that needs to be demanded to ensure that our industry doesn't become a mockery, right? Does not just become a mouthpiece for propaganda.
yeah.
Because I know that for a lot of people, that's increasingly what it seems and feels like, particularly when you're talking about Gaza.
No, definitely. And with that happening, with the industry becoming this mockery, we started to resort to social media. But even there, we found ourselves in a place where Israel has found a way to weaponize platforms like Meta, for instance, to almost shadow ban. I think all of us have witnessed it. Everyone that's online and is also pushing Palestinian solidarity and trying to show the world what's happening. The shadow ban issue has been one that was very, very big. We're trying to maneuver around it, trying to find words that maybe the algorithm won't pick up. All of this is happening, and it almost feels like the move is now on the digital censorship of things, and it has enabled the physical violence against reporters in Gaza continued also unabated. This space, I think, that you are also very, very involved in, the social media space. How do we go about existing within it and making sure that it becomes a bit more impactful than traditional media?
So, thank you for that question. So, I think obviously what we're seeing around Gaza is also the shift that was happening anyway, right? So, the majority of people under the age of 40 today, most people get their news off social media. There's increasing numbers of people who are deserting what we would call legacy media news completely, right? So, people aren't turning into watch those regular channels. They might watch a BBC report that pops up on their Instagram feed or on their TikTok or whatever, but they are not going to traditional mediums. And so what was the attempts to control the parameters of information dissemination that occurred within legacy media is now shifted to how do we control the dissemination of information in new media spaces, which are not that new anymore, but we'll call them new media spaces for the sake of this discussion. Within that, the challenge for many of us now is that obviously the censorship efforts that were perhaps a little less obvious within the legacy media space and now
Mm,
increasingly obvious, right, through the sorts of bans that we're seeing. So on TikTok, a direct ban on hashtag Free Palestine, or hashtag Free Luigi, depending, regardless of your views on either of those issues, right? It's still a free speech issue that we're discussing, and those are both now banned on TikTok. And or at least if you use them, your posts will be heavily shadow banned and lose any reach. And in Instagram, as we all know, there's a huge shadow ban on anyone sharing information on Palestine in particular, but of course on events in Gaza specifically. I don't have the answer right now for how we challenge that. I think in the long term, we need to build, those of us, I think, from more perspectives that I would call sort of global South resistance perspectives, need to be
mm,
thinking about new media spaces. We need, to remember that we have incredibly talented tech people all over the world who are capable of creating alternative tech centers. And we need to be investing in those alternative tech centers that are going to ensure that whatever restrictions others may try to impose, that there will always exist a space in which alternative perspectives can also be heard and disseminated.
I want to touch a bit on, the future of journalism, the future of this profession that, when even veteran reporters like Shireen Abu Akleh can be assassinated with impunity, essentially. What does Gaza teach us about the price of truth in an era of authoritarian militarism, essentially?
Wow, what a question. Thank you for that one. I mean, it's what does Gaza teach us at this time of growing? I think Gaza has revealed to us all that we have been living in La La Land, that
Mm,
all whilst many of us were sort of looking the other way, that there has been a huge power grab, and that the naked face of that power grab is being revealed to us obviously through the US administration, which is completely unabashed now. And I think, I have my own mixed feelings about the sort of unabashed white supremacy that's now in the White House, but at least it has the slight merit of just
mm,
being what it says it is, as opposed to sort of, I think, maybe things like the Biden administration, where a lot of people felt like, how could it be possible that Biden, he's a Democrat, like, how could he be supporting genocide? And it's like, well, actually, that tension between the purported image of America or the West and its actual actions is pretty much the most constant feature of Western
mm.
history.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
right. And so I think to some extent, what Gaza has been is an awakening predominantly for those in the global north about the reality of the systems that we're enmeshed with in, and the extent to which we are prepared to look the other way. And I
Mm,
think it's unraveled the liberal mythology most specifically, because of course throughout history there have been people who have denounced the extent to which the system is corrupt, that it is, experiencing undue influence from private interests whose interests are diametrically opposed to that of the majority of the citizens of the given country, for example, the US, but I could be talking about the UK similarly. And I think that um, for many people, there was a hope that you could continue to operate within the current system, and
mm,
that we would be on a sort of linear trajectory of progress, even if it wasn't huge leaps in progress, that it would be some degree of progress. And I think the real awakening that has happened around Gaza is that actually these concessions that liberals have built into the system in many ways have only deviated us away from truly acknowledging how far the rot has gone, and that maybe the liberal compromises have bought times for us to have more kind of civil brunches and feel like our day to day is unimpeded, for those of us in the comfort of the global north, but that
mm,
in reality, that the system that we think we are upholding is itself rotten from the inside. And that if we do not address that in the way that I think more radical traditions have been calling us to do for a long time, then what we're effectively doing is providing temporary cover for a system that is rapidly turning into fascistic military authoritarianism.
No, definitely. I think you put it really, really well. One of the
Thank
things
you.
that I've struggled with, and this is, in the Palestine solidarity circles that we find ourselves in, whether it's in social media or, on the ground where
Yeah.
actual work is being done, is and I think it's one of the reasons why maybe there hasn't been as much action as we had hoped for, is this supermanification, if I can put it that way, of the people of Gaza, the journalists of Gaza, the women and children of Gaza, because of how they are carrying themselves. They always preach steadfastness, and we won't be moved, we won't be shaken, and I think, and this is personally, I've struggled with it, and I think maybe you can touch on it also. Maybe we need to maybe step back a bit. I think we always talk about, the Israeli genocidal machine, not seeing them as humans, but I think we might have encroached on that ourselves, as people that claim that we're in solidarity with Palestine, because we think of them as these superhumans, and sometimes I think it holds us back from acting as hard as we would ordinarily do if we felt like these were superhumans. I'm not sure if I'm making sense,
No,
but it's
absolutely.
something that I struggle with a lot. Yeah,
Absolutely. And I think, look, it's a tension that occurs because when we support Palestinians, we never want to participate in a degradation of their humanity, their
true,
dignity, and their resilience, which is real, right? All of those things are real. Their dignity, their resilience, their steadfastness are all real things. But I completely hear you, I think, on the extent to which because we're dealing with people who have a huge amount of dignity and pride in their identity and their culture because of the ethnic cleansing that they've been experiencing for almost a century now, um, that we can confuse that with not recognizing the depths of
mm,
absolute hell that these people are living in,
mm,
and
mm,
sort of saying, well, they're just these hyper resilient people. They're almost superhuman, right? I couldn't do it, but my God, like how amazing it.
mm,
No, 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 no. And I completely agree with you at that extent that Palestinians have shown us the model of dignity and resistance to an attempt to dehumanize them, but we should be under no illusions that there are people in Gaza today waiting to die. you
mm,
know
mm,
they are waiting to die. There has not been an entry of food, medical aid, or clean water in over a month in Gaza. They are being bombed relentlessly while still trying to recover, in many cases, injured people from like all the previous years bombing. So when we say that this is hell on earth, I don't think it really captures
true.
what we're talking about. This is torture on every level: food, medicine, your environment, your access to medication, your ability to travel, your day-to-day fearing these drones that just appear out of nowhere and start shooting families, children, elderly people, safe zones you're told are safe zones that are not safe zones. I mean, this is horror upon horror. And so I think, yeah, I'm only emphasizing it to kind of confirm your point, which is let's not overstate the endurance of the Palestinian people. They need us now more
Mm.
than ever. And whatever sacrifices we might observe of theirs and think, wow, that's amazing. I suppose the question for all of us is, right, what is the commensurate sacrifices we are prepared to make on our end?
Ah, true. Yeah, I think perfect encapsulation there. Just in closing, Doc, it almost feels like we are in another chapter of this genocide. The return of Donald Trump has made it become something that we thought it was not going to be, because at some stage there were talks of ceasefire deals being made, and all kinds of talks being had, but then you have this new spanner in the works, that is Donald Trump, and it just took a different turn from there. From the solidarity fronts, from a media journalism point of view, this space, how do we respond to this new reality that, to be honest, it is unprecedented, and we were not in any way prepared, to have this earlier part of this year looking the way it is, looking at how we closed off the previous year?
Yeah, I mean, I think that personally, I never believed that the so-called ceasefire agreement was a ceasefire agreement. Those of us who were looking at the detail of that agreement, it very much appeared to be what it was, which is a hostage exchange deal, whereby Israel really had only agreed to a cessation of hostilities for two reasons. One was because this was ahead of Trump's inauguration, and I think there was some sort of maybe trepidation around what Trump would do, given that he'd said that he was going to bring peace to the region. I'm talking on the Israeli side, so sort of willingness to kind of play along with Trump at that point, and of course it was part of all the funfair and US mythology that is important to the administration's public image, that Biden could be seen to be the transition to Trump on a peace deal in the Middle East. I mean, it's all part of the smoke and mirrors that the
Mm,
administration is engaged with. But the reality was that that deal never had any mechanisms built into it that were going to ensure that we could go from phase one to phase two to phase three. And phase three was really the full cessation of hostilities and withdrawal of Israeli troops from Gaza. Ultimately, I think what the horror of the Trump administration is simply the horror of US foreign policy unmasked. As much as we might be horrified by what we're seeing, I personally believe that what we are truly horrified is by ourselves,
mm,
meaning that we cannot acknowledge, we cannot accept that these are the systems that we have built and been active participants in sustaining. And when it's nakedly revealed for what it is, it shows us all to be complicit within those systems. You don't have to have voted for Trump for the reality to be to come home to you, that the only way we get a Trump is through a Biden, is through an Obama, is through all the previous systems that we have allowed to fester to eventually give birth to what is here today. This didn't drop out of thin air,
mm,
right? Trump did not drop out of thin air. He is the product of our unwillingness as citizens to take seriously our democratic responsibilities, to take seriously accountability when it comes to corruption, when it comes to poverty, when it comes to wider equality. And, you know, uh, I believe that sometimes for a system to change, things have to get really, really bad, because
mm,
actually, when we look at how there is a tipping point in any society when it comes to change, often that tipping point involves people who had hitherto been protected from the impact of the horrors of that society suddenly become impacted. In other words, white people. In other words,
mm,
middle class people. In other words, people who had never been arrested by ICE, had never had a threat against their visa or immigration status, and suddenly are like horrified that they could be deported to El Salvador. But that's what was happening before. It was just
mm,
happening to Black and brown people, so no one cared. Right. So this is what
mm.
I mean. Like, we are suddenly awakening to, and I say we as in white people in the global north, awakening to the reality that actually this was always a system. It's just you thought you were protected from it and you're not.
And I think we're going to leave on that note, Doc. Thank you so much for giving
Thank you
us
for
your
having
time
me.
and for a very insightful conversation. And looking forward to chatting to you again in the not so distant
Thanks for
future.
those awesome questions. It was a pleasure to be with you. Have a lovely day.
You too. That
Thanks,
was
guys.
Dr. Myriam François. And yeah, another eye opening conversation. We're going to be continuing with our special broadcast on this systematic targeting of journalists. The Watson Institute has reported that Israel has killed more journalists in Gaza than in all major wars of the last century combined. And yeah, I think if we can just take a moment while we go to an ad break to just have that sink in the last century, all of the major wars around the world, globally combined, Israel has killed more journalists in Gaza than all of them. Going to take a quick break. The special broadcast continues after this.